The county crew arrived before sunrise with 2 trucks, a yellow lift, and a clipboard ordering the old radio tower down by noon. Helen Mercer was already standing at the locked gate in her nurse's coat, though she had not worked a night shift in 27 years. The coat was too large on her now. The sleeves hung loose around her wrists. The collar had gone soft from washing, but she wore it the way some people wore a wedding ring, not for show, but because taking it off felt like admitting something was over. Behind her, the abandoned clinic sat in the gray morning light, its windows boarded, its paint peeling, weeds growing through the cracked steps. Above it, the tower leaned against the sky. Its bent antenna pointed toward the ridge like a finger nobody wanted to follow. Commissioner Dale Brackett stepped out of his truck and gave her a tired smile. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "that tower hasn't saved anybody since Carter was president." The men behind him laughed softly. Not cruelly at first, just the way people laugh when they think age has turned memory into confusion. Helen did not move. She held an old microphone in one hand and a ring of clinic keys in the other. "Then why?" she asked. "Did it hear a voice last night?" No one answered. By sunset, the whole county would be without power. By midnight, 3 children would be trapped beyond a washed-out mountain road. And before the sun came up again, that broken tower would force Helen Mercer to face the one call she had spent 40 years trying to forget. If stories about forgotten people, old promises, and things the world was too quick to throw away mean something to you, consider subscribing, because what happened next was not just about an old nurse, a broken tower, or a forgotten clinic. It was about the truth still waiting in the static. Dale Brackett looked at the locked chain across the clinic gate and sighed as if Helen Mercer had tied it there to ruin his morning. He wore a county jacket over a pressed shirt, hair combed neat, clipboard held to his chest like a shield. Behind him, the yellow lift coughed diesel into the cold light. 2 workers stood with orange cones. Down the hill, a Ridgeline communications van waited against cracked pavement. They had come prepared. Helen had come alone. "Mrs. Mercer," Dale said, lowering his voice. "We discussed this at the hearing." "No," Helen said. "You discussed it." "I listened." One worker turned his head to hide a smile. The tower rose behind her, crooked against the ridge. Rust marked the lower braces. One antenna leaned at a bad angle. A warning sign hung from the fence, faded until the red letters looked almost pink. Dale lifted the paper. "This is the final removal order. The structure is condemned. If you interfere, the county can cite you." Helen looked at the seal, then at the tower. "I bought this property legal. You bought an abandoned clinic and a liability," Dale said. "There's a difference." Before Helen could answer, a car door slammed near the road. Her son, Mark Mercer, hurried up the gravel shoulder. His face changed when he saw the trucks, the lift, the workers, and the microphone in his mother's hand. "Mom," he said quietly, "please don't do this out here." That hurt more than Dale's order. Helen could stand strangers, thinking she was foolish. She could stand county men treating her like paperwork with a pulse. But Mark's shame had a different weight. It had grown between them since she spent the last of her savings buying the clinic at auction. He had wanted her closer to town. Somewhere safe. Somewhere without stairs. Leaking ceilings. Bad wiring. And a radio tower everyone called dangerous. "You shouldn't have come," Helen said. "Sheriff Nolan called me." Dale gave a small nod. "I thought family might help keep this calm." Helen turned on him. "Do not use my son like one of your orange cones." For a moment, no one spoke. Then a worker coughed, and the silence broke. Mark stepped closer to the gate. "Mom, they have an order. If you block them, they can fine you. They can sue you. You don't have money for that. I know what I have." "No," Mark said, voice tight. "You have a bad knee, a leaking roof, and a building full of things nobody uses anymore." Helen looked past him at the clinic. The front windows were boarded. Weeds pushed through the steps. Paint peeled from the doorframe in long white curls. But behind the west window, in the room nobody else cared about, the old radio console still sat under its dust cover. "Nobody uses anymore." People said that about things right before they needed them. Dale softened his voice, the way officials did when witnesses were present. "Mrs. Mercer, no one is trying to erase your service. You helped this county for a long time." Helen almost smiled. Service was the word people used when they wanted you to step aside and be grateful for disappearing. "I was here when phone lines went down," she said. "I was here when babies came early in snowstorms. I was here when men came off that ridge coughing coal dust and nobody wanted to drive up after dark." Dale's expression tightened. "This is not 1983. The year landed between them like a slap. Mark heard it. Dale noticed that Mark heard it. A cold wind moved through the tower. Metal creaked overhead. Then Sheriff Nolan Price rolled up in his cruiser. He got out with his hat in one hand and his radio in the other. "Morning, Helen," he said. "Nolan." He glanced at the trucks, then toward the ridge, where low clouds gathered dark and heavy. "I've got a weather alert," he said. "Rain moving faster than expected. Possible slides east of Black Hollow by evening." Dale frowned. "That makes removal more urgent." Helen turned toward the clinic. From inside the old building came a sudden burst of static. Everyone heard it. It slipped through the boarded windows, thin and sharp, like a breath pulled through teeth. Then came another sound beneath it. Not a word. Not quite, but close enough. Helen unlocked the chain before anyone could stop her. "Mom," Mark said. Dale stepped forward. "Mrs. Mercer, do not enter that structure." But Helen was already walking toward the clinic, the old microphone swinging from her hand. Behind her, the men who had come to tear down a dead tower stood listening to something none of them could explain. And for the first time that morning, nobody laughed. The clinic door stuck the way it always had. Helen put one shoulder against it, pushed, and felt the old wood give with a tired groan. Dust moved in the hallway. The smell came back first. Damp plaster, cold metal, old paper, and something faintly medicinal that had never fully left the walls. Behind her, Mark called her name. She did not answer. Some rooms remembered people better than people remembered themselves. The front desk was still there, though the county had stripped away the phones years ago. The waiting chairs sat crooked against the wall. A faded poster about blood pressure curled at the corners. Beyond the hall, behind a door with flaking green paint, waited the room Helen had not been able to abandon. The radio room. For most of Claiborne County, the clinic had been a place where children got stitches, minors had lungs checked, and old women came in pretending they only needed aspirin when what they really needed was someone to sit with them a while. For Helen Mercer, it had been the first place that made her feel useful after her life cracked open. She was 29 when her husband, Thomas, died on a wet October road, coming back from a supply run. Mark was 4. Helen remembered the deputy at her kitchen table, turning his hat in his hands, unable to look directly at the cereal bowl still sitting in front of her son. After the funeral, people told her to move closer to her sister in Lexington. They said Claiborne was too hard a place for a young widow. Too many mountain roads. Too many winter nights. Too little money. Too much memory. But Helen stayed. She stayed because leaving would have meant admitting that everything Thomas loved had been too small to keep. She stayed because Mark knew every bend in the creek road. She stayed because the clinic needed a nurse who could drive in snow, change a dressing by lantern light, and tell the difference between a frightened mother and a dangerous fever. Claiborne did not have much then. It had coal trucks, church suppers, a diner with 3 cracked red stools, and a county office that always seemed warmer than the houses it served. Up in the ridges, some families still shared party-line telephones. Some had no reliable phone at all. When storms came down hard, wires snapped, roads vanished, and whole hollows became little islands of fear. That was when the tower mattered. It stood behind the clinic on 4 steel legs, taller than anything else on the hill, with guide wires humming in the wind. The radio console inside the clinic had big black knobs, a green light, a speaker that crackled like frying bacon, and a microphone heavy enough to bruise your palm if you held it too long. Helen learned its language from an old dispatcher named Lloyd Ames. "Don't listen for perfect words," Lloyd told her on her first winter shift. "Perfect words are for telephones. Radio gives you pieces. You listen for rhythm, breath, panic, place names, water, wind, engines, anything that tells you where a person is before the line dies." So Helen listened, She heard a boy with a broken arm call from a logging road where his father's truck had slid into a ditch. She heard a pregnant woman's brother stammer through directions during a January ice storm. She heard miners call in with crushed fingers, burned eyes, bad coughs, and once, a man who could not say anything except his wife's name over and over until Helen sent help anyway. The tower was not sentimental to her then. It was work. It was fear turned into procedure. It was the difference between being alone and being found. By 1983, Helen had become the nurse people asked for by name. She could start an IV in a moving truck. She could calm a child while cleaning gravel from an open knee. She could look at a miner's face and know whether he was joking to keep from admitting pain. But she was still a widow with a son to feed. That mattered. It mattered more than she wanted it to. On the night of the 11th of February, 1983, snow had been falling since before dark. Not pretty snow. Hard, bitter snow that came sideways and filled ditches before anyone noticed the road was gone. Mark was asleep in the little back room behind the clinic office because Helen had not been able to find anyone to watch him. He had brought a blanket from home and a toy truck with one missing wheel. Helen had just finished wrapping a burned hand when the radio cracked open. At first, there was only static. Then a man's voice came through, thin and broken. "Clinic, this is Black Hollow Ridge. You copy?" Helen reached for the microphone. "Black Hollow, this is Claiborne Clinic. Go ahead." The reply came in pieces. "Walls talking. East seam. Water coming through. Told them this morning." Helen sat straighter. In the mines, men did not say a wall was talking unless they meant pressure. Shift. Rock. Something deep inside the mountain beginning to move. She grabbed the logbook and wrote the time. 9:42 p.m. Before she could ask for names, the door opened behind her. Warren Brackett stepped into the radio room with snow on his shoulders. Back then, Warren was the county emergency coordinator, though everyone knew he carried more power than the title admitted. He had a courthouse voice, a mine owner handshake, and a way of smiling that made people agree before they understood what they were agreeing to. "What did you hear?" he asked. Helen covered the microphone with her hand. "Black Hollow. They're reporting pressure on the east seam." Warren's face did not change. "Probably panic," he said. The radio spat again. "Need evacuation before." Static swallowed the rest. Helen lifted the microphone. "Black Hollow. Repeat. How many men are inside?" Warren stepped closer. "Do not put that in the official log yet." Helen looked at him. "I already wrote the time." "Then leave it at that." Outside the radio room, the clinic lights flickered. Somewhere in the back, little Mark turned in his sleep and coughed. Helen heard it. Warren heard it too. His eyes moved toward the hallway. "You have a child to think about," he said softly. "You want to keep this job, Helen. You want to keep your license? Then, you do not start a county panic over a broken transmission from men who've been warned about false reports before." She should have argued. That was the sentence that had followed Helen for 40 years. She should have argued. Instead, she sat with one hand on the microphone and the other on the logbook while the speaker hissed and popped. She told herself she needed confirmation. She told herself Warren knew more than she did. She told herself a nurse did not outrank the county emergency coordinator. By morning, Black Hollow Ridge was on every radio channel in eastern Kentucky. Cave-in, blocked entry, bad weather, slowing rescue, conflicting reports. Later, the official statement said there had been no reliable warning before the collapse. Helen said nothing. She tore no pages from the logbook. She forged no report. She accepted no money. She only did the smallest cowardly thing a person can do. She let a lie pass through the room without stopping it. For years, she told herself silence was not the same as guilt. But every winter after that, when snow scraped against the clinic windows and static breathed through the speaker, Helen heard the unfinished voice from Black Hollow Ridge. "Need evacuation before." And then nothing. That was why she bought the clinic when no one else wanted it. That was why she kept the keys. That was why, even now, with county trucks outside and her son ashamed at the gate, Helen walked toward the radio room as if the past were calling again. Because before anyone could understand the tower, they had to understand the room that taught Helen Mercer how to listen. The radio room door was swollen from years of damp weather. Helen had to lift the knob and push with her hip before it opened. When it did, the smell inside was different from the rest of the clinic. Less like mold, more like dust, warm wire, and metal that had once carried voices through storms. Mark stopped in the doorway. He had not been inside that room since he was a boy. Back then, he used to sit on the floor with his toy trucks, while Helen worked overnight shifts. He remembered the green light on the console. He remembered the hiss of static. He remembered his mother's voice changing whenever she picked up the microphone. Calmer, lower, like she could hold a whole frightened county steady with one hand. Now, the room looked smaller. The ceiling tile had sagged near the corner. A water stain ran down the wall. The radio console sat under a gray dust cover. Beside it stood a metal filing cabinet with one missing handle. Above the desk, an old county map had faded until the roads looked like pale veins. Dale stopped behind Mark and coughed once. "This is exactly what the inspection described," he said. "Water intrusion, outdated electrical, possible animal damage. Nobody should be operating anything in here." Helen pulled the dust cover from the console. The men expected junk. They expected broken knobs, dead lights, cracked wires, a museum piece with no museum to take it. What they saw was old, yes, but not abandoned. The console had been cleaned recently. The frequency dial was marked with small pencil lines. The microphone cord had been wrapped with black tape. Not pretty, but careful. A notebook lay beside the speaker, its pages filled with dates, weather notes, and signal fragments written in Helen's narrow hand. Colin Reese, the young Ridgeline engineer, stepped into the room with a flashlight. He looked barely 30, with a trimmed beard, expensive boots too clean for the mud outside, and a tablet tucked under one arm. He glanced at the console the way a doctor might glance at a patient already declared dead. "This is low-band analog," he said. Helen nodded. "It is. County doesn't use this band anymore." "County stopped listening to it," Helen said. "That is not the same thing." Colin gave a polite smile. Mark heard it and hated it. Not because Colin was cruel, because he sounded reasonable. That was the problem with the whole morning. Everyone sounded reasonable, except Helen. Dale pointed toward the tower visible through the dirty window. "The issue is not whether you have fond memories. The issue is that the tower is unsafe. It's not grounded to current standard. 2 base bolts are compromised. One guy wire anchor has shifted. If that structure falls, it could hit the clinic, the access road, or a responder." Helen looked out at the tower. He was not entirely wrong. The east leg had rust at the plate. The ladder cage was bent. A strip of old red paint had peeled away where the wind worried it year after year. The tower no longer looked like something that belonged to the future. But Helen had never trusted it because it looked strong. She trusted it because it had worked when stronger-looking things failed. Colin set his tablet on the desk and checked the wall outlet. "This system shouldn't even be connected to power." "It isn't," Helen said. He looked at her. She tapped the old marine battery under the desk, then the small charge controller mounted beneath the shelf. Solar trickle from the south panel. Enough to receive. Sometimes enough to transmit if the weather is kind. Dale stared at her. "You installed that?" "Thomas taught me wiring before he died. Lloyd Ames taught me radio after." Mark looked at the battery, then at his mother's hands. He had spent months imagining her sitting alone in this building, confused by memory. He had not imagined her checking charge levels, cleaning terminals, logging weather, repairing old systems one careful piece at a time. Colin crouched beside the console. Against his will, professional curiosity began replacing dismissal. "This coax line should be useless," he murmured. "The insulation is ancient." "The main line is," Helen said. "Backup line runs through the west wall." Colin turned his flashlight. Behind the filing cabinet, half hidden under peeling paint, a black cable disappeared through a hole drilled long ago in the baseboard. Dale frowned. "None of this changes the removal order." "No," Helen said. "But it changes whether you are tearing down a dead tower or a working receiver before a storm." At that, Sheriff Nolan stepped farther into the room. "Can it transmit?" Helen did not answer quickly. That was answer enough. "Sometimes," she said, if the wind has not pulled the antenna too far out of line, if the battery holds, if the person on the other end is close enough, high enough, or desperate enough. The last words settled over the room. Colin reached toward the frequency dial. Helen caught his wrist. "Not fast," she said. He froze. She released him, then turned the dial herself with 2 fingers. Static filled the room. The workers outside fell quiet. Rain began ticking against the clinic windows. Helen moved the dial in tiny increments, pausing between each one, listening not like a woman hoping for a miracle but like someone reading a language other people had forgotten. For almost a minute, there was nothing. Then a faint sound rose under the static. 3 broken pulses. A pause. 2 more. Colin's eyes moved to the signal meter. The needle trembled. Mark whispered, "Is that someone talking?" Helen did not answer. Her eyes were on the old map above the desk. There, near the far right edge, beneath a water stain and a thumbtack hole, was a road printed so faintly most people would miss it. Black Hollow Service Road. On the county's new maps, it no longer existed. Dale saw where she was looking. His face changed only a little. But Helen noticed. She had spent her life noticing the moment people heard something they wished they had not. Static breathed through the speaker again. Helen reached for the notebook and wrote the time. Then she turned the page and found an old red mark beside one frequency, the same frequency she had written down 40 years earlier. Outside, the men still saw a broken tower, a condemned clinic, and an old woman refusing to let go. But inside that room, Helen Mercer saw something else. A receiver that still had power, a map with a missing road, a signal coming from a place the county had erased. And somewhere beneath the static, the beginning of the next mistake if nobody listened in time. Sheriff Nolan was the one who bought Helen time. Not much. 24 hours. Dale Brackett hated the idea the moment it left the sheriff's mouth. Helen could see it in the way Dale's fingers tightened around the clipboard. But the weather alert had changed the air inside the radio room. So had the trembling needle on Colin Reese's signal meter. A dead machine did not move a needle. A dead tower did not pull sound out of weather. Nolan kept his voice even. "If there's any chance this thing can receive emergency traffic from the east side, I'm not comfortable tearing it down before the storm passes." Dale looked at Colin. "Is there a chance?" Colin hesitated. It was only half a second, but it was enough. "There is signal activity," he said carefully. "That doesn't mean usable communication." Helen almost respected him for the honesty. Almost. Dale turned back to Nolan. "Fine. 24 hours. But if Mrs. Mercer cannot demonstrate a reliable transmission, removal proceeds tomorrow morning." Mark stepped forward. "And if she gets hurt in here?" No one answered him. That was what Mark hated most. Everyone had an answer for bolts, wires, county codes, and storm alerts. Nobody had an answer for what an 81-year-old woman's body could survive. Helen heard his fear, even under the anger. "I am not made of paper," she said. "No," Mark replied. "You're made of stubbornness and old promises. That doesn't make you safe." The words cut deeper than he intended. Helen looked away first. By late morning, rain had started in earnest. It tapped on the clinic roof, gathered in the broken gutter, and fell in a steady thread outside the radio room window. The county crew waited under the lift canopy, smoking, drinking gas station coffee, and watching the clinic like it was a show. Colin brought in a small toolkit from his van. He tested the outlet, the battery, the charge controller, the backup cable, and the grounding line with increasing seriousness. The more he checked, the less he smiled. "This shouldn't be working this cleanly," he muttered. Helen sat in the old chair beside the console. "It was never clean. It just worked. That is not a technical category. It is in the mountains." He glanced at her, unsure whether to argue. Mark stood near the filing cabinet with his arms crossed. Every few minutes, his eyes went to the sagging ceiling tile, then to his mother's knee, then to the stairs outside. He was measuring danger the way Dale measured liability. Helen knew that look. She had used it on feverish children. Colin finally straightened. "Receiver has partial function. Battery is weak but stable. Transmit circuit is questionable. Antenna alignment is poor. If we attempt a broadcast, range will be limited." Dale, who had returned to the doorway, seized on the word. Limited. Colin did not look at him. I said limited, not impossible. Helen reached for the microphone. The room seemed to shrink around that old black handle. Her fingers remembered its weight before her mind did. Thumb on the side. Mouth not too close. Speak clearly. Leave space for the signal to travel and return. Nolan stepped to the doorway and lifted his own radio. Dispatch is standing by on County Channel. We'll log any confirmed reception. Dale looked at the county workers outside. Witnesses are present. Helen knew what he was doing. If the tower failed, it would fail in front of everyone. If she failed, Mark would see it. Nolan would see it. Colin would see it. The men outside would have a clean story to tell over lunch. Old Helen Mercer thought she heard ghosts in a radio. She adjusted the dial to the marked frequency. Static filled the room. She waited. Then, she pressed the microphone button. Claiborne Clinic to County Dispatch. Radio check. Do you copy? Static. She released the button. Rain ticked on the glass. Nolan looked at his handheld radio. Nothing. Helen waited 10 seconds and tried again. Claiborne Clinic to County Dispatch. Radio check. Do you copy? The speaker hissed. The meter trembled once, then fell flat. Outside, one of the workers said something Helen could not hear. Another laughed. Mark's face went hard. Helen tried a third time. Slower. Claiborne Clinic to any station receiving. This is Helen Mercer at the old South Ridge Tower. Do you copy? Static rose loud, then collapsed into silence. Nolan lowered his eyes. Colin checked the cable again. Could be antenna shift. Could be water in the connector. Could be the transmit side is dead while receive still functions. Dale stepped into the room. That is enough. Helen did not move. I said that is enough, Dale repeated. Mrs. Mercer, you had your chance. We all heard it. No, Helen said quietly. We heard nothing. Exactly. She turned toward him. No. There is a difference between silence and nothing. Dale's patience thinned. This is what concerns me. You are building meaning out of static. Mark took one step toward his mother. Mom, please. The word please did what Dale's order could not. Helen set the microphone down. Dale wrote something on his form. Removal resumes at first light, weather permitting. Nolan frowned. Dale, no. I allowed the delay. She attempted demonstration. It failed. Colin looked as though he wanted to object, but the evidence sat heavily in the room. No confirmed transmission. No reply from dispatch. Only static. By afternoon, the county trucks left the hill. The yellow lift remained parked near the gate, like a promise. Dale told one worker to chain the outer fence again, but Nolan quietly handed Helen the key before he drove away. Mark stayed. For a while, he and Helen stood in the radio room without looking at each other. You scared me today, he said. I scared myself. That answer softened him for 1 second. Then he saw her reach for the chair. No, he said. You are not staying here all night. Helen sat down anyway. Go home, Mark. This is not a shift at the clinic. No, she said. It is worse. He stared at her, waiting for more. She gave him nothing. That was another kind of silence. The kind that had built a wall between them for years. Mark left just before dark, angry enough to slam the clinic door, worried enough to pause outside until he saw the lamp come on in the radio room. Helen waited until his headlights disappeared down the hill. Then, she put on the old headphones. The room changed after dark. Rain became louder. The clinic settled in small wooden sighs. The tower creaked in the wind like something old trying to stand through pain. Helen turned the dial back to the red-marked frequency. Static. She closed her eyes. Lloyd Ames had taught her not to chase a signal. Let it come. Let the noise separate itself. Listen for rhythm, breath, panic, place names, water, wind, engines, anything that tells you where a person is before the line dies. At 9:43 p.m., the static broke. 3 pulses, a pause, 2 pulses, then a thin scrape of sound. Helen held her breath. It came again. 3. Pause. 2. Not speech. Not yet. But not weather either. Her hand moved to the notebook. She wrote the time, the pattern, the wind direction, the battery level. Then, under location, she hesitated. After a long moment, she wrote 2 words. Black Hollow. Outside, rain thickened against the glass. Somewhere beyond the ridge, water was beginning to move downhill, gathering speed in ditches, culverts, and forgotten roads. And by morning, the county would learn that Helen Mercer had not been trying to prove the tower could talk. She had been trying to prove someone was still calling. By dawn, the rain had stopped pretending to be weather and had become a force. It came hard over Claiborne County, flattening the weeds around the clinic steps, washing orange mud across the access road. The tower vanished and reappeared behind sheets of rain. Each time lightning flashed beyond the ridge, its bent antenna looked less like junk and more like a hand raised in warning. Helen had not slept. She sat in the radio room with her coat over her shoulders, the headphones crooked against one ear, her notebook open beneath the weak yellow lamp. The battery meter had dropped during the night. Not dead, not safe either. The green receive light still glowed, but faintly. At 6:18, the county emergency channel began to break apart. Dispatch asked a deputy to repeat his location twice. Then Sheriff Nolan's voice came through, clipped and rough, saying County Road 9 had water over both lanes near Miller Creek. A volunteer fire captain reported a tree down across the old mill road. Normal storm trouble. Then the cell alerts stopped. Helen noticed before anyone said it out loud. The handheld scanner beside the console went quiet for too long. No message tones. No clean digital chirp from the repeater. Only rain. Only static. At 7:03, Sheriff Nolan's voice cracked through the scanner. Dispatch, I'm losing you on the east side. Repeat. Repeater is dropping. Do you copy? The answer came in pieces. Copy. Standby. Tower battery. Then nothing. Helen reached for the red-marked frequency. The old receiver hissed awake. 3 pulses. A pause. 2 pulses. This time, beneath the pattern, she heard something else. A breath. Then a child's voice, bent almost beyond recognition by rain and distance. Please. Helen sat up so quickly her knee struck the desk. She pressed one hand against the headphones. Say it again, she whispered, though she had not transmitted. Static swallowed the room. Then the voice came back, thinner, cold. Helen wrote the time. Her hand shook so badly the number 7 looked like a broken branch. The clinic door opened behind her. Mark stepped in, soaked from the shoulders down, rainwater running from his hair to his collar. He stopped when he saw her face. What happened? Helen lifted one finger. The receiver hissed. 3 pulses. Pause. 2. Mark's anger did not vanish. Fear simply stepped in front of it. Is that the same thing from last night? Helen nodded. Mom, that could be anything. No, she said. Weather does not get scared. Sheriff Nolan arrived 10 minutes later. Boots muddy, hat gone, his uniform jacket dark with water. Colin Reese came behind him, carrying a hard case and a coil of cable. Dale Brackett was last. The phone useless in his hand. We've got 3 missing kids, Nolan said. The room went still. Names? Helen asked. Tyler and June Pritchard, 11 and 9. Their cousin Ben Avery, 10. Their grandfather took them fishing near Laurel Fork yesterday afternoon. Search team found the grandfather's truck above County Road 17, empty. Mark closed his eyes. Helen looked at the old map. Laurel Fork is not Black Hollow. No, Nolan said. But if the lower bridge washed, he might have tried the ridge cut-through. Dale shook his head. There is no ridge cut-through. Helen pointed to the faint road printed beneath the water stain. Black Hollow Service Road. It used to connect Laurel Fork to the old mine access. County stopped maintaining it after the cave-in. Dale's mouth tightened. That road is closed. Closed is not gone. Colin connected a small meter to the backup line. I'm getting signal spikes again, Dale snapped. From where? That's the problem, Colin said. This old system does not give you GPS coordinates. It gives you direction, strength, and a reason to keep listening. Helen almost smiled. The receiver crackled. A child cried out. This time, everyone heard it. Not clearly. Not enough to make a sentence, but enough to make every adult in the room stop breathing for half a second. Grandpa won't wake up, Mark whispered. Oh God. Nolan grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Price. Possible voice contact with missing juveniles through South Ridge Analog Tower. Begin search grid toward Black Hollow Service Road. Only static answered. His digital radio had failed. Dale looked pale now. Not angry. We can't send people up a closed mine road in this weather because of static. Helen turned slowly. You were ready to tear down a tower because of paperwork, she said. Do not tell me now that a child's voice is less real than a bolt inspection. Nolan made the decision. Colin, can you keep this receiver alive? I can try. Helen, can you keep listening? She looked at the microphone. I never stopped. For the next 20 minutes, the radio room became what it had been 40 years before. A place where fear entered as noise and left as instructions. Helen listened and asked the children to tap if they could hear her. 3 taps for yes. 2 taps for no. The answer came slowly, through stone, rain, distance, and a dying battery somewhere on a mountain. 3. Pause. 2. Not random, not weather, a system. The children could hear her sometimes. Not well. Not always. But enough. Helen learned they were in a little shed near black water. She heard the word tracks, then rocks, then cold. Colin shifted the antenna line by hand and watched. The meter jump whenever Helen angled the old tower toward the east ridge. Mark held the flashlight. Nolan marked the map with a pencil. Dale stood behind them, silent. The man who had arrived with a removal order now watched an old nurse draw a rescue route from fragments nobody else knew how to trust. At 8:11, Helen heard one more word. Hollow. She closed her eyes. Not because she was relieved, because the past had just stepped into the present and used a child's voice to do it. Nolan pointed at the map. Black Hollow Service Road. We move now. Dale grabbed his sleeve. That road is not certified. Nolan pulled free. Neither are miracles. He turned to Helen. Stay with them. Outside, engines started. Doors slammed. Men who had laughed at the tower ran through rain toward trucks and rescue gear. Mark stayed beside his mother, holding the flashlight steady over the map. For the first time since she bought the clinic, he did not ask her to come home. He only asked, "What do you need?" Helen listened to the frightened breathing of children somewhere beyond the ridge. Then she answered like the nurse he had almost forgotten she was. More battery, dry paper, and nobody talking unless I ask. The first rescue truck left the clinic hill at 8:19. Helen wrote the time down without thinking. Old habits were strange things. Even when her hands shook, even when 3 children were somewhere out beyond a ridge in rising water, part of her still believed that if a thing mattered, it had to be logged. Sheriff Nolan's voice came through the scanner in broken pieces as his team climbed toward the east road. Clinic, this is Nolan. We're passing Miller Creek. Water over the lower bridge. Visibility poor. Helen looked at the old county map. Mark held the flashlight above it, his hand steady now. Colin crouched beside the console, one palm against the backup cable as if he could feel the signal through the wall. Do not take the lower bridge, Helen said into the microphone. Turn before it. There used to be a logging spur past the stone culvert, Static answered. Then Nolan came back. I don't see a spur. Helen closed her eyes. She could see it as it had been in 1983, a narrow cut in the trees, half gravel, half clay, with a leaning sycamore at the entrance and a rusted gate that miners used to leave open during shift change. Look for a sycamore split down the middle, she said. Gate may be down. Road will look like runoff. A pause. Rain hissed through the speaker. Then, found it. Mark looked at his mother, not with apology. Not yet. With astonishment. Helen did not have room in herself to receive it. Go slow, she said. That road drops hard on the left. The next 40 minutes took longer than most years Helen had lived. The children came and went through the static. Sometimes Helen heard only crying. Sometimes a cough. Once she heard a boy say, Ben's sleeping, and the words made every adult in the radio room go still. Keep him awake if you can, Helen said. Tell him help is coming. A girl answered. Are you the lady? Helen swallowed. Yes, sweetheart. I'm the lady. My grandpa fell. I know. You did good calling. Now listen to me. Colin adjusted the auxiliary cable, then moved to the west wall where the backup line entered. Signal strengthens when the tower pulls east, he said. Wind's moving it. That tower has been leaning east for 20 years, Mark said. Helen glanced at him. Today, it has manners. For the first time since morning, Colin almost laughed. Then the signal dipped. The child's voice vanished under a roar of static. Helen lifted one hand for silence. Nobody moved. She listened past the rain, past the old hum in the console, past the panic rising in her own chest. There. Not a voice. Water. Fast water, close to metal. Nolan, she said. Ask if they can hear water against metal. Static. Then Nolan. Repeat. Ask if they are near metal. A shed, a pipe, a gate. I hear water hitting tin. The sheriff relayed the question through his failing equipment, and his own men spread through the ridge. Minutes passed. Then the little girl's voice returned, broken, but clear enough. Roof is loud. Helen marked the map. Old pump shed, she said. Dale Brackett had come back into the room sometime during the rescue, though Helen had not noticed when. His jacket was wet. His face looked drained of all official color. There was a pump shed? He asked. Helen did not look at him. For the mine wash line? She said. Before the county said none of that infrastructure mattered anymore. Dale said nothing. Nolan's team found the truck first. It had slid sideways off the old service road, one front wheel hanging over a washed-out edge. The grandfather was inside, alive but unconscious, blood on his forehead, his hand still wrapped around a useless cell phone. The children were not there. They had crawled out through the passenger door and followed what they thought was the sound of water toward a shed, trying to get out of the rain. Instead, they had trapped themselves beside a drainage channel, filling faster every minute. Helen kept them talking. She asked Tyler to tap the wall 3 times if he could see daylight through any crack. She asked June to count between thunder and lightning. She asked Ben to say his name every time his eyes wanted to close. Mark stood behind her, hearing his mother become someone he had not heard since childhood. Not fragile, not confused, necessary. At 9:07, Nolan's voice came through the scanner. We see the shed. The room seemed to stop breathing. Helen leaned toward the microphone. June, listen to me. When you hear men outside, do not open the door unless they call your grandfather's name. Do you understand? 3 taps came back. A pause. Then 2. Helen frowned. No? A small voice answered. Door stuck. Nolan heard it too. We're at the shed, he said. Door jammed, water rising behind it. We're forcing entry. Then came the longest static Helen had ever heard. No voices. No taps. Only rain and distortion and the faint groan of old metal somewhere beyond the ridge. Mark put one hand on the back of Helen's chair. She did not turn, but she felt it. At 9:14, the radio cracked. We have them. Colin bowed his head. Mark exhaled like he had been holding the breath since he was 4 years old. Outside, one of the county workers shouted to the others. The news moved down the hill faster than any official alert had managed to travel all morning. All 3 children alive. Grandfather alive. Hypothermia risk. Head injury. But alive. Helen took off the headphones and set them on the desk. Her ears rang in the sudden quiet. No one laughed. No one mentioned removal orders. No one called the tower dead. Dale stood near the doorway, staring at the console as if it had betrayed him, or worse, as if it had remembered him. Sheriff Nolan's final message came through before the signal faded. Clinic, this is Nolan. Tell Helen Mercer we owe her 3 children. Helen closed her eyes. For one dangerous second, the room wanted to make her a hero. She could feel it happening. Mark's hand on her shoulder. Colin's stunned respect. The workers outside murmuring. Dale unable to meet her eyes. But Helen knew better than to accept a clean version of herself. The tower had saved children today. That did not erase the men it had failed to save 40 years ago, or the nurse who had let silence sit in the official record. Colin was the one who found the panel. He was tracing the backup cable along the west wall, trying to understand how the old system had held a signal through the storm, when his flashlight caught 4 screws that did not match the others. "These are newer," he said. Helen turned. The panel sat beneath the map, behind the filing cabinet. Not large, maybe 2 feet wide, painted the same dull green as the wall, but fitted too neatly to be accidental. Mark helped him pull the cabinet away. The legs scraped against the floor. Dale took 1 step into the room. "Careful," he said. Everyone looked at him. It was the wrong word said too quickly. Colin removed the screws. Behind the panel was a narrow hollow in the wall. Inside lay a cloth pouch, gray with dust, tied with old medical tape. Helen did not move. Mark reached for it. "Don't," she whispered, but he had already lifted it free. The tape broke dryly under his fingers. Something small and plastic slid into his palm. A cassette. Its white label had yellowed with age. The ink was faded, but still readable. The 11th of February, 1983. No one spoke. Rain tapped on the window. The tower creaked above them, tired from the storm, tired from being useful. Mark looked from the date to his mother. "What is this?" Helen's lips parted, but no sound came. Dale answered before she could. "That doesn't belong to you." His voice was low, not official now, afraid, and in that moment, the rescue was no longer the biggest thing in the room. The children were alive because the tower had remembered how to listen, but hidden behind the wall was proof that the tower had remembered something else too, something Claiborne County had spent 40 years trying not to hear. Dale Brackett reached for the cassette, as if he had forgotten there were other people in the room. Mark pulled it back, not far, not dramatically, just enough that Dale's fingers closed around empty air. For the first time all morning, the county commissioner looked less like a man enforcing an order and more like a boy caught near a locked drawer. "That tape is county property," Dale said. Helen was still staring at the label. The 11th of February, 1983. The ink looked faded, but the date felt fresh enough to bleed. "How would you know that?" Mark asked. Dale straightened. "Because this clinic operated under county emergency authority. Any emergency recording made here belongs in county archive." "Archive?" Colin said quietly. "You mean the same county that erased Black Hollow Service Road from the current maps?" Dale turned on him. "You are here as a contractor, and apparently as the only person in this room with a screwdriver," Colin said. It was not a joke, but it landed like one. Outside, rain was easing into a hard mist. Down the hill, the county workers were gathered near their trucks, talking into phones that worked only when they caught a brief bar of service. News had already begun moving through Claiborne. 3 children found alive. Old Tower helped locate them. Helen Mercer heard them first. Stories did not wait for official statements in small towns. They traveled through diner kitchens, church text chains, volunteer fire radios, and the mouths of people who had sworn they would not tell anybody yet. Dale knew that too. His face tightened every time another phone buzzed. Sheriff Nolan returned to the clinic just after 10, mud to his knees and exhaustion under his eyes. He had ridden back ahead of the ambulance convoy while rescue crews carried the grandfather down off the ridge. "They're alive," he told Helen. She nodded once. There were days when good news was too large to hold. Nolan saw the cassette in Mark's hand. "What's that?" Dale answered too quickly. "A county record. It needs to be secured." Nolan looked at Helen. "Is that true?" Helen did not know how to answer. 40 years earlier, she would have asked Warren Brackett what to do. That shame moved through her now, with a cold familiarity. Mark slipped the cassette into his jacket pocket. "My mother is not handing anything over until we know what it is." Dale's voice lowered. "Be careful, Mark." Mark looked at him. "I've spent 6 months telling her to be careful. Funny how I'm only hearing it from you now." The room went quiet. Helen closed her eyes for a moment. She had wanted Mark to stop seeing her as fragile. She had not wanted him pulled into the old machinery of Claiborne County. The quiet warnings, the soft threats, the way powerful men used calm voices to make fear sound like common sense. A car came up the access road too fast, tires slipping on wet gravel. Grace Holloway stepped out with a raincoat, a camera bag, and the determined posture of someone who had spent years being told local stories were too small to matter. She ran the Claiborne Ledger now, though most people still called it the paper, even after it moved online. "Helen," Grace called from the hallway. Is it true the old tower picked up the missing kids? Dale muttered. Absolutely not. Grace looked at the mud on Nolan's pants, the pale faces in the radio room, the old console still glowing faintly. That sounds like a yes. This is an active emergency matter, Dale said. Grace's eyes shifted to the cassette-shaped bulge in Mark's pocket. Reporters saw what people tried not to show. And that? Nothing, Dale said. Helen finally spoke. Not nothing. Every face turned toward her. The words had left her before courage fully arrived. But once spoken, they stood there, waiting for her to become the kind of woman who could follow them. Dale took a step closer. Helen, you do not want to do this in front of a reporter. That was true. She did not. She did not want to do it in front of Mark either. Or Nolan. Or Colin. Or the ghosts of men whose names she had avoided for 40 years. But wanting had stopped being the question. Before Helen could answer, another voice came from the doorway. He said that same thing the night the ridge fell. Everyone turned. Ruth Ann Pike stood in the hall, one hand pressed against the doorframe, breathing hard from the climb. She was 76 now, smaller than Helen remembered, with silver hair pinned badly under a plastic rain hood. In 1983, she had been the clinic's part-time aide, the kind of woman who knew where every spare blanket, thermometer, and secret was kept. Helen felt the room tilt. Ruth Ann looked at the cassette, then at Dale. You look like your father when you're scared. Dale's face flushed. Mrs. Pike, this is not your concern. It became my concern when I spent 40 years wondering if I should have opened my mouth. Mark looked from Ruth Ann to his mother. The hurt in his face deepened. There's more, he asked. Helen could not lie to him. Yes. Ruth Ann stepped into the room. There was a call before the collapse. Not after. Before. Men up there knew something was wrong. Helen heard it. I heard pieces from the hall. Warren came in and told her not to log it. Dale's voice sharpened. That is a serious accusation against a dead man. Ruth Ann did not flinch. The dead are not improved by our silence. Grace had stopped reaching for her camera. Even she understood that some moments should not be stolen before they were understood. Nolan looked at Helen. Why didn't you tell me? Helen let out a breath that almost became a laugh. You were 12. He had no answer for that. Mark touched his jacket pocket where the cassette rested. What is on this tape? Helen looked at the console. The cassette player built into the old unit had not been used in years. Its clear plastic door was scratched. One button was missing its silver cap. But beside it, a small red light still waited beneath dust. I don't know all of it, she said. I only know what I remember. Dale seized on that. Exactly. Memory is unreliable, especially after 40 years. That tape could be damaged. It could be misinterpreted. It could hurt families who have already suffered enough. That was the cruelest part. He was not entirely wrong. Helen thought of the miners' wives, their children, their grandchildren, people who had built lives around the official story because that was the only story they had been allowed to grieve. If the tape only held dying voices, playing it would be an act of violence. If it held proof, hiding it would be another one. Mark moved closer to Helen. His voice was low enough that only she heard the first words. Mom, you just saved those kids. We can leave now. Let the sheriff handle this. Let the state handle it. You don't have to destroy yourself today. She looked at her son. For a moment, he was 4 years old again, asleep in the back room under a borrowed blanket while she chose her job over the truth. I already destroyed something by waiting, she said. Mark's eyes filled, but he did not look away. Dale lifted his hand toward the cassette again. Helen, give it to me. I will make sure it is preserved properly. Ruth Ann gave a dry, bitter laugh. That is what your father called it too. Preserving order. Helen reached toward Mark. After a second, he placed the cassette in her palm. It felt impossibly light. Too light to carry a cave-in. 3 dead men's reputations, a county's lie, and 1 nurse's cowardice. Helen turned to Nolan. Sheriff, I want you here when we play it. Then to Grace. You may listen, but you do not record until I say. Grace nodded. Finally, Helen looked at Dale. If your father told the truth, this will protect him. Dale said nothing. His silence answered for him. Helen slid the cassette toward the player, but her fingers stopped at the door. For 40 years, she had remembered only fragments. Static, pressure, Warren's voice, Mark coughing in the back room, her own hand hovering over the logbook. Now the room waited to hear what memory had softened, what guilt had sharpened, and what the tape had kept exactly as it was. Helen pressed eject. The cassette door opened with a small plastic click. It sounded louder than thunder. The cassette did not go in smoothly. Helen had to turn it once, then again, as if even the old machine resisted what they were about to do. The plastic door clicked shut with a sound so small it made everyone in the room feel foolish for fearing it. No one sat except Helen. Mark stood behind her right shoulder. Sheriff Nolan stood near the door, his hat in both hands. Grace Holloway had lowered her camera and taken out a notebook instead. Colin stayed by the console, watching the old tape deck like a man, suddenly aware that not every machine became obsolete at the same speed. Dale Brackett stood farthest from the desk. He had the look of someone waiting for a verdict he already knew. Helen pressed play. At first, there was only hiss, then a warble, a click, and the low grinding sound of a tape that had not moved in 40 years. A voice came through, not clear, not whole, but human. Black Hollow Ridge, East Seam. Anybody copy? Ruth Ann covered her mouth. Helen closed her eyes. The room changed around them. The damp clinic, the wet jackets, the county trucks outside, all of it seemed to fall away. For a moment, they were not in the present. They were back in a snowstorm, listening to a frightened man call from inside a mountain. Walls talking, water coming through, told them this morning. Grace stopped writing. Mark looked at his mother. This was the story he had never been given. Not by the county, not by school, not by his mother. Black Hollow had always been a tragedy, with a paragraph attached to it. Cave-in, bad weather, rescue delayed, men lost, families grieved. A sad thing, a closed thing. The tape kept moving. Helen's younger voice appeared next, sharper than anyone expected. Black Hollow, this is Claiborne Clinic. How many men are inside? Static. Then the minor again. Not just us. Whole east side shifting. Foreman called it in before shift. They said, keep cutting. Dale's face went gray. There was a scrape on the tape, then a door opening. Another voice entered. Warren Brackett. Even through age and static, the resemblance was unmistakable. Dale had his father's tone when he wanted a room to obey him without noticing. What did you hear? Warren asked. Helen's younger voice answered. Black Hollow. Pressure on the east seam. They're asking about evacuation. A pause. Then Warren said, do not put that in the official log yet. The room went utterly still. That was the first truth, but not the deepest one. For a few seconds, the tape seemed to lose itself in static. Then another man's voice appeared, lower, rougher, unfamiliar to most of them. Colin whispered. Who is that? Ruth Ann answered without looking away from the machine. Cal Vardner, mine operations manager. On the tape, Vardner said, if we pull them now, we lose the contract. We already had inspectors crawling around last month. Warren replied, then get your foreman to call it a ventilation issue. Not structural. Helen's younger voice cut in, trembling. Men are still inside, Vardner said. Men are always inside. Mark flinched as if the words had struck him. The tape rolled on. Warren's voice lowered, but the recorder had caught enough. We need confirmation before we start a county panic. Helen said. They confirmed. He said they told them this morning. Warren replied, a frightened minor is not confirmation. Then came the sound Helen had remembered for 40 years but never in full. A child coughing in the back room. Little Mark. On the tape, Warren paused. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more dangerous. You have a child to think about, Helen. You want to keep this job? You want to keep your license? Then you leave the log as it is until I tell you otherwise. No one looked at Mark. That made it worse. He stared at the tape deck as if it had reached back through time and placed him in the room where his mother's courage had failed. Helen's younger voice said nothing. The silence that followed was longer than any sentence. Then the minor came back, faint, and breaking apart. Clinic. Please, if you can hear, tell Ruth Miller I tried. Tell my boys. Ruth Ann made a small wounded sound. Helen pressed one hand flat against the desk. She had thought she remembered the worst of it. She had not. The false story had been easier to survive. A garbled warning, a powerful man, a frightened young widow, a choice made under pressure. But the tape held more. It held the fact that the warning had been clear. It held the fact that the mine had known earlier that day. It held the fact that Warren Brackett had not been confused, not cautious, not waiting for confirmation. He had been calculating. The tape clicked forward. Vardner again. If this gets logged as prior warning, we're finished. Warren answered. Then it does not get logged as prior warning. Helen's younger voice finally spoke, small and strained. What about the families? There was a chair scraping. Then Warren said, the families will need the mine open next month more than they need a courtroom next year. Dale turned away. Not because he did not believe it, because he did. The tape ended in a burst of static and a hard mechanical stop. No one moved. Rain had softened outside. Somewhere down the hill, an ambulance siren faded toward town. 3 children were alive because Helen had listened today. But inside the radio room, the dead had finally finished speaking. Grace's pencil hovered above her notebook. Sheriff Nolan broke the silence first. How many died? 4 in the collapse, Ruth Ann said. 2 more within a year from injuries in lungs. But the official report named only 3 as directly caused by the cave-in. Helen nodded. Her voice came out dry. And they blamed Amos Miller for the first warning. Ruth Ann looked at her. Helen kept going, because stopping now would be another kind of lie. Amos was the man on the radio. The report said he was unstable, said he made confused claims after equipment noise. Later, people said he had been drinking. His widow stopped coming into town after that. Grace finally wrote something down. Mark's voice was quiet. What happened to the families? Helen looked at the map. At Black Hollow. At the road removed from newer county records. At the place where a living child's voice had forced all this back into daylight. They were paid less, she said, because the company said there had been no verified prior warning. Some got nothing beyond burial help. Some signed papers they did not understand. Ruth Ann added, Amos Miller's boys left school early. One went to Ohio for factory work. One joined the army. His wife died still believing half the county thought her husband panicked and made things worse. Nolan's jaw tightened. Colin, who had said almost nothing, pointed at the old map. And the road? Dale did not answer. Helen did. After the investigation closed, the county stopped maintaining the Black Hollow service road. Later maps left off the pump shed, the wash line, the east access, all of it. Easier to forget a place if no one can find it. There it was. The deep secret was not only that men had died after being ignored, it was that the county had built a cleaner future by sanding the names off the past. A warning became confusion. Negligence became weather. A service road became blank space. A nurse became silent. And a family like the Millers carried shame that had never belonged to them. Mark stepped away from Helen. Only one step. But she felt it as if he had crossed the room. You knew this? He asked. I knew pieces. That's not what I asked. Helen looked at her son. The little boy coughing on the tape was gone. In his place stood a grown man who had spent months thinking his mother was being swallowed by age, only to learn she had been carrying a truth heavy enough to bend her life around it. I knew enough to speak, she said. And I didn't. Dale's voice came from near the window. My father is dead. Helen turned to him. So are the men he helped leave in that mountain. His face tightened, but he had no defense left. Only fear. Grace looked at Helen. Do I have permission to report what I heard? The question was gentle. That made it harder. Helen looked at Mark first. His eyes were wet, angry, wounded. But he did not shake his head. Then she looked at Ruth Ann, at Nolan, at Colin, at Dale, at the microphone lying beside the recorder, like a witness waiting to be sworn in. For 40 years, Helen had told herself that silence had protected her son. Now she saw what it had protected instead. A lie. Yes, she said. Dale stepped forward. Helen, once this goes out, you cannot take it back. She touched the stop button on the tape deck. I know. Her hand moved to the old logbook. This time, she opened it in front of everyone. "Sheriff," she said, "you should take the tape. Not to county archive. To the state." Nolan nodded. Grace closed her notebook. Mark said nothing. That silence hurt. But Helen accepted it. Truth did not owe her a gentle landing. Outside, the tower stood crooked against the clearing sky. It had saved the living that morning. Now it had done something harder. It had given the dead back their warning. And Claiborne County would have to decide whether it was finally ready to hear the rest. By evening, Claiborne County had 2 stories moving through it. The first was easy to tell. 3 children had been found alive because an old nurse and a broken radio tower heard what every modern system missed. That story made people proud. The second story was harder. A cassette hidden inside the old clinic suggested that Black Hollow Ridge had not been an unavoidable tragedy. It suggested men had warned the county before the collapse. It suggested the official record had not simply been incomplete. It had been shaped. By 7 o'clock, the county meeting room was full. People stood along the walls, wet coats dripping onto the floor. Volunteer firefighters leaned near the back. Miners' widows sat in the front row, some with adult children beside them. Grace Holloway sat near the aisle with her notebook closed for once. Sheriff Nolan stood by the door, the cassette sealed in an evidence bag and held against his chest like something fragile enough to break the room. Helen entered with Mark on one side and Ruth Ann Pike on the other. Nobody clapped. She was grateful for that. Applause would have been too easy. Dale Brackett sat at the commissioner's table under a framed photograph of his father shaking hands with 3 men in mining helmets. Someone had turned the photograph slightly toward the wall before the meeting began. Not removed, not destroyed, just turned enough that Warren Brackett no longer seemed to preside over the room. Dale looked older than he had that morning. When Helen reached the front, the room quieted. She did not stand behind the podium at first. She looked at the faces instead, some curious, some angry, some tired in the particular way people become tired when grief is asked to wake up after decades. "My name is Helen Mercer," she said. A few people shifted. Everyone knew her name. "I was the nurse on duty at Claiborne Clinic on the 11th of February, 1983. The room changed. Not loudly, just enough. I heard a warning from Black Hollow Ridge before the collapse. I wrote the time down. I heard men say the east seam was shifting. I heard that the warning had already been given earlier that day." She stopped. Mark looked at the floor. Helen forced herself to continue. "Warren Brackett told me not to place it in the official log. He told me I could lose my job, my license, my ability to feed my son." Dale's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. Helen turned slightly toward the front row, and I listened to him. A sound moved through the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur. "I did not cause that mountain to fall," Helen said, "but I let a lie stand where the truth should have been. I have lived long enough to know those are not the same thing. I have also lived long enough to know they are closer than I wanted to admit." In the front row, a woman in a dark blue coat stood slowly. "My father was Amos Miller." Helen's hands tightened on the podium. The woman looked about 60, with silver in her hair and a face that carried both restraint and weather. "My mother died believing people thought Daddy panicked," she said. "She stopped going to church because she heard whispers. She sold the house for less than it was worth and moved us 2 counties over." Helen nodded. "I am sorry." The woman's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "I didn't ask for sorry." Helen accepted that like a deserved blow. "No," she said. "You didn't." Sheriff Nolan stepped forward then and placed the evidence bag on the table. "This cassette has been logged and will be transferred to state investigators tonight. I have also requested preservation of all county emergency records, mining correspondence, maps, inspection files, and compensation documents related to Black Hollow Ridge." All eyes moved to Dale. For a moment, he looked as if he might retreat behind procedure. Then, he looked at the evidence bag. Maybe he heard his father's voice again. Maybe he saw the rescue trucks on the ridge. Maybe he understood that the old ways of controlling a room did not work once the room had heard the tape. "I will sign the preservation order," Dale said. Someone in the back muttered, "Now he will." Dale flinched, but continued. I will also recuse myself from any county decision related to Black Hollow records. Grace wrote that down. It was not redemption. Helen knew that. A signature did not repair a widow's reputation. A recusal did not pay back lost compensation. A public statement did not give Amos Miller's sons their school years back. But it was the first official action in 40 years that did not move the truth farther underground. Ruth Ann stepped beside Helen. I heard pieces that night too, she said. Not enough to understand all of it. Enough to know Helen was scared. Enough to know I was scared too. I told myself it was not my place. She looked at Amos Miller's daughter. That was cowardice with a polite name. The woman in the blue coat looked at both old women for a long time. Then she said, I want my father's name cleared. Nolan nodded. That starts tonight. Other voices followed. A grandson asked about unpaid benefits. A former miner asked why the East Access Road had vanished from later maps. A school teacher asked whether the children in Claiborne had ever been taught the names of all the men lost, not just the ones the county report admitted. Questions filled the room, one after another. Not as noise, but as something returning to circulation after being trapped too long. Mark stood near the wall, watching his mother answer what she could and refuse to soften what she could not. When the meeting ended, he walked her outside. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart over the ridge, and the tower stood black against a pale strip of evening sky. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Mark said, I don't know what to do with all this. Helen looked at him. I don't either. He nodded. It was not forgiveness, but it was honest. After a moment, he took off his jacket and put it over her shoulders because the night had turned cold and she had forgotten to bring one. That, too, was not forgiveness, but it was something still alive. Behind them, in the meeting room, Sheriff Nolan sealed the cassette for transport. Dale signed the first preservation order. Grace Holloway began writing the story that would not fit into one headline. And on the hill above the abandoned clinic, the old tower waited for the final decision everyone now knew was coming. It had spoken. It had saved. It had accused. But rust was still rust. And truth, Helen was beginning to understand, did not always require the thing that carried it to remain standing. By spring, the hill behind the clinic was green again. Not beautiful in the way postcards were beautiful. Claiborne County had never been that kind of place. The grass came up uneven. Mud held in the tire tracks. The old clinic still leaned a little toward the road, and the roof still needed more money than anyone wanted to name. But the weeds around the steps had been cut. The windows were no longer boarded from the inside. And every Thursday evening, there were cars parked along the gravel shoulder, where county trucks had once idled with a removal order. The Black Hollow investigation did not end quickly. Truth, once opened, did not move like a hymn. It moved like paperwork, testimony, missing files, damaged maps, pension records, mining contracts, and people trying to remember dates they had spent half their lives trying to forget. State investigators took the cassette. Then the logbooks. Then copies of the old maps. Grace Holloway's first article became 3. Then 7. Amos Miller's name appeared in print without the old word unstable attached to it. His daughter kept the newspaper folded in her purse for weeks, not because it healed everything, but because it finally said what her mother had died waiting to hear. The county did not become honest overnight. No place did. Dale Brackett resigned from the Emergency Records Committee before the first hearing. Later, he testified about files he had seen as a younger man and pretended not to understand. Some people called that courage, others called it late. Helen thought both could be true. The tower remained standing through March. Then the final engineering report came back. Unsafe, not politically inconvenient, not symbolically complicated. Unsafe. The east leg had deeper corrosion than anyone first believed. One anchor point had shifted under the spring thaw. The bent antenna could not survive another hard wind without risking the clinic, the access road, or anyone foolish enough to stand beneath it and call memory protection. This time, when Sheriff Nolan brought the report to Helen, he did not come with trucks. He came alone. He found her in the radio room, labeling a box of copied maps. I wish it said something different, he told her. Helen read the report from beginning to end. Then she folded it once and set it on the desk. "No," she said. "You don't." Nolan looked at her. "If it has to come down, it has to come down safe." He studied her face, as if searching for the woman who had once chained the gate. What changed? Helen looked at the microphone, the receiver, the logbook, the map with Black Hollow marked in red. "I thought keeping it standing was the same as keeping faith," she said. "It wasn't. Sometimes a thing does its work and then asks to be let go." The dismantling happened on a clear morning in April. No crowd was invited, but people came anyway. Volunteer firefighters stood near the fence. Colin Reese arrived with 2 young technicians and a toolbox that no longer looked too clean for the mud. Ruth Ann Pike sat in a folding chair with a blanket over her knees. Grace Holloway watched without taking photographs at first. Mark drove Helen up the hill. He did not ask if she was sure. That was one of the ways she knew he had begun to forgive her, or at least to stop treating her like a problem that needed managing. The crane lifted the antenna first. For a moment, it hung against the sky, rusted and crooked and strangely delicate. Then it came down slowly, guided by ropes, lowered onto padded boards in the grass. Helen did not cry. She had cried enough in rooms where nobody saw. The crew removed the crossbars next, then the upper sections. Each piece came down with groans of metal and careful commands. By noon, the tower that had pointed over Claiborne for decades lay in numbered sections along the hill. It looked smaller on the ground. Most things did, once people stopped fearing them. But not everything was hauled away. Colin had helped Helen remove the receiver, microphone, backup battery, and the old frequency dial before the tower came down. The logbooks were copied and sealed. The originals went into evidence where they belonged. The working copies went into a new cabinet at the volunteer rescue station, not a museum, a training room. Helen insisted on that. "A thing like this should not sit behind glass," she told Nolan. "It should make somebody useful." So Thursday nights began. At first, only 5 people came. 2 volunteer firefighters, 1 dispatcher, Colin, and a 17-year-old girl named Leah Price, Sheriff Nolan's niece, who had grown up thinking radios were what people used when phones failed in movies. Helen taught them to listen, not dramatically, not like a legend. She taught them how to write down time before memory changed it, how to mark wind direction, how to tell engine noise from water, how to wait between bursts of static instead of filling fear with talk, how to ask questions that could be answered with taps if a voice was too weak to speak. "Perfect words are for telephones," Helen told them one evening. Leah looked up from her notebook. "Then what is radio for?" Helen thought of Amos Miller, of 3 children in a pump shed, of Warren Brackett's voice on tape, of her own silence and the long road back from it. "Radio is for what is left when perfect fails," she said. Mark came to the 3rd training. He stood in the doorway at first, arms folded, pretending he was only there to fix the loose hinge on the supply cabinet. Helen let him pretend. Halfway through the session, Leah lost a practice signal under static and frowned at the headphones. Mark stepped closer. "My mom says don't chase it," he said. "Let it come back." Helen did not look at him, but she smiled down at the logbook. Later, after everyone left, Mark stayed to stack chairs. The evening light came through the rescue station windows in long gold strips. "I used to hate that tower," he said. "I know. I thought it was taking you from me." Helen closed the cabinet. "For a while, maybe it was." He nodded slowly. Then he picked up the old microphone from the table and weighed it in his hand. "It's heavier than I remember." "Most things are." He set it down carefully. Neither of them said forgiveness. They were not ready to make a word carry more than it could hold. But when Mark drove her home that night, he took the long road past the clinic hill. The tower was gone from the skyline. In its place was open air. Below it, the old clinic waited for whatever it would become next. Maybe a rescue annex. Maybe a records room. Maybe only a building that had finally stopped hiding. Helen looked up at the empty hill and felt no panic. The promise had not been broken. It had changed shape. Weeks later, during a training drill, Leah Price sat at the old console with headphones pressed tight against her ears. Rain tapped against the station roof. Colin adjusted the practice transmitter from the far side of the building. Nolan watched from the doorway. Mark stood beside his mother with 2 cups of bad coffee. Static filled the room. Leah started to speak. Helen lifted one finger. Wait. The girl waited. Under the noise came a faint pattern. 3 taps. A pause. 2. Leah's eyes widened, not with fear, but recognition. She picked up her pencil and wrote the time first. Helen leaned back in her chair. The tower was gone from the hill. But the next time a voice came through the static, Claiborne County knew how to listen.